Thank you very much, and of course thank you to Rabbi Levi, to BINA always for having me, and not just today, but the general relationship and help that you give me on a personal level, and of course also the shul as well. Now, giving a shiur on the 30th, being asked to give a shiur on the 30th of December is a little bit like being asked to give a shiur like at 3 a.m. on Shavuot. So on the one hand, you've got to make the title interesting, because otherwise, it's nice and sunny outside. There's Bondi Beach 5 minutes down the road. It's summer holidays. On the other hand, I know that the people are interested, of course, in hearing very real and important content. So in that way, it's a little bit like 3 a.m. on Shavuot morning or evening or night. And so therefore, that was when Rabbi Levi messaged me asking me if I'd give the shiur. We just had another baby. So it was a while ago, but thank you. But I thought, off the top of my head, what's something interesting that I could speak about? So without thinking about what exactly were these 5 responsa, I said, I'll give a shiur on the 5 most interesting halachic responsa in the last 100 years. And now you're going to ask me, how did I actually pick the halachic responsa? So as you'll see, obviously these things are open to interpretation. There's no one who's written a book or made a statement saying these are the 5 most important halachic responsa. But what I actually did was I sort of polled it. So for example, after people saw Rabbi Levi put it on Facebook, and after people saw it was advertised, I had all these people writing in saying, are you going to talk about this tshuva? Are you going to talk about that tshuva? Yeah, okay, all right, I'll talk about that tshuva. Anyway, so I had a few ideas in my head. I also based it on some of the ideas other people thought I wanted or was going to talk about. So before we begin, I'm also going to apologize because I think we're only going to have time for 4. So if we have time for 4, maybe come back next year, I'll give the last one. But there's just obviously so much to talk about on each and every one of these halachic responsa, and I also want to give sort of an introduction about halachic responsa throughout the ages. So I don't think we're going to have time for 5, we might only have time for 4, so I apologize in advance. The concept of halachic responsa, of writing a letter to someone with a question and they provide that response, already in the times of the Gemara, the times of the Talmud, although we don't have it in the same format that we have today or have had for the last probably 800 to 1,000 years, already in the Talmud there are references all over the Gemara to rabbis asking questions of their colleagues, of their superiors, and receiving a response, and the communication between the rabbis of Bavel, the rabbis of Babylon, and the rabbis in the land of Israel. Throughout the ages we have some responsa which still today people quote, even though they've never read them. For example, the Rambam, Maimonides, whose tshuva, whose halachic responsa to Ovadia the ger, Ovadia the convert, who asks him, am I allowed to say in the Amidah, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, our God and the God of our forefathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the response that Maimonides gives to him. And throughout the ages, really the halachic responsa that we have today have existed for centuries, and throughout the ages, going back to the times of the Rambam, but I'd say even to the times of the Gaonim, the Gaonic period about 1500 years ago, but Rav Shua Gaon, who probably most people here haven't heard of, who writes a halachic responsa which details and lays out the Torah Shebal Peh, the chain of the transmission of the Torah from one generation to the next. So throughout the ages, and almost in each and every generation, there are hundreds, sometimes thousands of halachic responsa, and obviously after the printing press they become even more, and they become more accessible. But throughout the ages, dating back hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years, maybe even more than 1,000 years, because I just quoted something from the times of the Gaonim 1,500 years ago, throughout the ages there have always been halachic responsa which have changed the Jewish world, and I want to focus on some of them over the last 100 years. What is so important about the last 100 years as opposed to the last 500 years or the last 800 years? If you think about the changes that have happened both to the Jewish people and also to the outside world in terms of modern technology, medicine, the re-establishment of the state of Israel, all of those things have changed the Jewish world forever, and in a very short period of time. Unlike really any other century that we can think of, the last 100 to 150 years, both the Jewish world has changed dramatically, but also the outside world. And it has therefore posed a number of questions that we weren't necessarily even thinking about or could even have imagined were questions 200, 250 years ago. That's why some of these are so interesting, and not just interesting, but change and have changed the Jewish world in one way or another. The first two that I'm going to talk about are Halachic responsa from a rabbi named Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia Yosef. Now, because most of the people in this room, and actually most of the Australian Jewish community are Ashkenazi, when we talk about the leaders of the Jewish people, both in terms of their scholarship and also their leadership in the last, or let's call it the second half of the 20th century, if I was to ask you who were the great rabbinic leaders of the second half of the 20th century, who would you say? Guys, also, I should have said this right at the beginning, I hate just standing here talking and no one talks back. So we're going to make it more of a discussion. If I was to ask you who were the great rabbinic leaders in the second half of the 20th century and ask you to throw out some names, which names would you throw out? Bavitcher Rebbe, Moshe Feinstein, Rashi is probably a bit further back than the last. Rashi's a while ago. Sorry? Chofetz Chaim was the first half of the 20th century. The Stipler definitely, Moshe Feinstein, Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. None of you have, of course, mentioned Rav Ovadia Yosef. And that's because most of you in this room are Ashkenazi. But the impact that Rav Ovadia Yosef has on the Jewish world through his halachic responsa, through his scholarship, and also the impact he has on the state of Israel through the political party which he establishes, which is called, still running today, is beyond anything that I think we can comprehend even a few years after his passing. Rav Ovadia Yosef, born in Iraq in the 1920s, born to a family that has absolutely nothing. They immigrate to Israel when he's young. They can't even afford, for example, as the story goes at least, some kind of money for a candle so that he can continue to learn at night times. So what does he do? Goes outside, he learns by the moonlight. And he eventually, his father is persuaded to send him to yeshiva instead of to send him off to a trade. He then becomes, right before actually the establishment of the state of Israel, in 1947, when he's already a young and up-and-coming and very promising Talmid Chacham, Torah scholar, he's sent to Egypt. Interestingly, he doesn't really see eye to eye with the Egyptian Jewish leadership, so he leaves after a few years. He then becomes the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv in the 60s, the chief rabbi of Israel in the 70s, then sets up the political party, but all of that is just sort of a biographical sketch. If you really want to understand who Rav Ovadia was, you actually have to read his halachic responsa. Because each one could really be a doctorate in and of its own, a thesis. His scholarship, the way he could remember things, the way if you look at his halachic responsa, the number of different books and rabbis that he quotes from, and that's just to understand his scholarship. If you want to understand the impact he has on the Sephardi community, which by the way is at the establishment of the State of Israel, the majority is Sephardi, the impact he has on the fabric of Israeli society, you only had to look at how many people attended his levaya, his funeral. They say something like 600,000-700,000 people in his funeral. They say that there were two people who the Sephardi community in Israel, and obviously that's a big generalization, right? Because within the Sephardim, they're from lots of different countries. But the Sephardi community in Israel credit two people with, they say that Hemichziru lanu et hakavod, they returned our honor to us, because when they return to the state of Israel, when they come back to Israel running away from the countries that they came from, they're very much dominated and felt down, that sort of the Ashkenazi elite looks down upon them, and there are two people that sort of return them their honor. One is actually an Ashkenazi man called Menachem Begin, and the other one is Rav Ovadia Yosef. The fact that he was seen not just by the Sephardi community, but by Gdolei Israel, by the great rabbis all over the world, as one of the preeminent halachic authorities in the second half of the 20th century. He really returns in so many more ways than just the fact that he's a Talmid Chacham. The Sephardi community adored him in a way that if you're Ashkenazi, I don't really think you can understand. So not only is he a Talmid Chacham, as we know, also he sets up Shas, which is a political party which has a very big influence on Israeli politics and society until this day. But that's just an introduction. At the end of the day, the talk is supposed to be about the halachic responsa. So I'm going to talk about two. Two which I think in certain ways change part of Israeli society, or change the way that the makeup of Israeli society, or change the way people are thought of, or influences an entire group of people. The first is his responsa about the Ethiopian Jewish community. What can people tell me about the Ethiopian Jewish community?
Questionable about whether their status was properly Jewish, and therefore in many ways they were disenfranchised or put through a difficult trying time.
Spoken like a true Ashkenazi, but that's it's basically true. Okay, they have a history going back close to 2,000 years. Obviously, there are certain parts of the Masorah, of the tradition, that they don't get because they're living in Ethiopia, very much a group in and of themselves. And already in the 16th century, one of the halachic authorities in the 16th century is asked a question about an Ethiopian Jew who makes their way to Egypt. Anyone heard about this? The Radvaz. That was his sort of acronym. And he's asked whether they're Jewish, the Radvaz, because they claim that they're descendants of which tribe, the Ethiopian Jews? Dan. They claim to be the descendants of the tribe of Dan. And they ask the Radvaz, are they descendants of the tribe of Dan? And basically the Radvaz says, yes, this particular person who ends up in Egypt, this person's actually Jewish. What happens then, let's fast forward a few hundred years, the beginning, the establishment of the state of Israel, and the chief rabbi of the time. Who is the first chief rabbi of the state of Israel?
Rav Kook.
Everyone's going to say Rav Kook, and they're wrong. Why are they wrong? Because Rav Kook is the first chief rabbi of the Yishuv, of the what there was in Palestine. He is the first chief rabbi. But when I say first chief rabbi, so I shouldn't say you're wrong because it was a trick question. But the first chief rabbi after the establishment of the state of Israel, who's also has a doctorate, and also, to give you another clue, was the former chief rabbi of Ireland. His name was? Rav Herzog. And today there's another very prominent rabbi who used to be the former chief rabbi of Ireland, and that is the chief rabbi of the UK today. Rabbi Mervis was also the former chief rabbi of Ireland. But Rav Herzog makes Aliyah from Ireland. He's chief rabbi of Ireland, becomes the rabbi, the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Israel, is the rabbi at the beginning of the establishment of the state. And in 1954, Rav Herzog is asked this question about the Ethiopian Jewish community. And of course, Rav Herzog, just like we do, knows this about this tshuva, knows about this halachic response of the Radvaz. But he says, no. The Radvaz didn't really understand. He had sort of scientific and anthropological evidence that they might not be, the Ethiopian Jewish community might not be who they claim to be. And therefore he says that any Ethiopians coming to Israel would have to go through some kind of conversion. Exactly. And you can imagine that that is very hurtful for the Ethiopian Jewish community. But in 1954, there weren't as many coming or wanting to immigrate, and therefore not as much of a big deal. Still a big deal, but not as much of a big deal. It becomes more of a big deal when they themselves are running away and trying to get to Israel. And the Jewish agency, they're trying to come and claim that they can come back to Israel automatically because of the law of return. And the Jewish agency says, no, you're not Jewish. We have the written responsa of Rav Herzog, the first chief rabbi of Israel, who claims that you're not technically Jewish, therefore we're not going to help you, we're not going to save you, you can't automatically come. And it's Rav Ovadia in 1973. who writes a tshuva, who writes a halachic responsa, saying absolutely that the Ethiopian Jewish community are 100% Jewish. They don't even need to do a giyur l'chumrah. He says they don't even need to convert just sort of out of astringency. They're 100% Jewish. And what is his basis for that? He says the Radvaz, a few hundred years ago, somebody asked the sage and authority of the time. He said they were Jewish. Since then, there's nobody who's come and refuted that claim. Therefore, he says there's a chazaka, there's a presumption, unless anyone can explicitly prove it to me, otherwise that they must be Jewish. Now that, since we're talking about it academically, seems like, yeah, whatever. But you can imagine for the Ethiopian Jewish community, by the way, that changes, even though there are many people who disagree with him. Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Tzitz Eliezer, both of whom we'll talk about soon. And I think also his colleague, who was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi Rav Goren, also doesn't agree with him. Nevertheless, it changes the Jewish Agency's whole attitude to the Ethiopian Jewish community. And as you know, they bring in many different operations, the biggest one I think being Operation Moses, they bring many of that community to the state and land of Israel. Still, I think the rabbinate's official position was they did have to go through some kind of giyur l'chumrah, some conversion just out of astringency. But Rav Ovadiah's psak, Rav Ovadiah's tshuva, his halachic responsa, changes the world for the Ethiopian Jewish community, because all of a sudden they're considered Jewish, they can come back to the land of Israel, the law of return, etc. So that was the first responsa of Rav Ovadiah's that I wanted to have a look at. The second has to do not with immigration, but actually much more with, some would call it halacha, some would call it politics, I guess, but it has to do with the debate, which isn't really a debate anymore, but it's the debate which at different times becomes a hot topic, and I'm sure will become a hot topic again, the land for peace debate. So if you talk about it from a halachic perspective, not talking about is it a good idea, is it not a good idea, what are the reasons halachically, don't tell me about security and this and that, halachically, what are the reasons? Because there are many different authorities over time who have said that it's forbidden to give away parts of the land of Israel. What is the halachic reasoning and logic behind that? Because it's dangerous. No. So 100%, that's definitely true. But let's say that all the army generals and whoever else is involved in these kind of decisions and has the intelligence, let's say, and obviously it's very hypothetical today, but let's say that they actually said, no, we think the land for peace will, not only will it not endanger us, it will actually add to our security. Now they've said it before and it didn't really happen, so I know that it's hypothetical, but let's say that was the decision made. That there was no danger in giving land away. There are still many authorities say it's forbidden. Does anyone know why?
Hashem gave it to us.
Hashem gave it to us. Sorry?
He promised it to Abraham. He gave it to us.
Okay, he gave it to us, and so he can't give it away.
It's saying I don't know. It's kind of saying to Hashem, "Don't worry about it. We'll give it to them."
Okay, that's
give it away.
All right. So I guess the Ramban Nachmanides says not exactly what you're saying, but similar. Yes, Jeff.
If it's Eretz Israel, it's got certain kedusha, you can't give away.
Okay, so again, you're probably a combination of the two things we're going to talk about, so we'll get straight to it. There is a pasuk in the book of Vayikra, there's a sentence in the third book of the Torah when it comes to talking about the land of Israel that says, Virishta. What does the word Virishta mean? From the word Yerusha, that with regard to the land of Israel, you should inherit it, V'yashavta ba, and dwell in it. And on that, the Ramban goes on and on and on, Nachmanides, for paragraphs, talking about the importance of the mitzvah, the commandment of Yeshuva Aretz, of dwelling in the land of Israel. And he says, it is forbidden to leave this land desolate and be overtaken by the other nations. There is a mitzvah even when it's not, even when there's no Beit HaMikdash, when there's no temple, to inherit the land, to possess the land, to make sure that other people don't come, other nations don't come and possess the land. And based on that, many people understand the Ramban as saying it's forbidden, therefore, to give away any part of the land of Israel. The other more explicit prohibition, which is learnt out from a pasuk in Sefer Dvarim, from a sentence in the book of Dvarim, the 5th book of the Torah, is, it's got to do actually in this case with selling, but it would be the same, it would have no practical difference. This is more talking about selling land to non-Jews in the land of Israel, from the word lo techanem. Exactly, in the end of Parashat Va'elchanan. So we're talking about the book of Dvarim. There's an explicit prohibition. The Torah tells us when you go and inherit the land of Israel, lo techanem, which I think literally would mean don't have mercy on those who are living in the land. This whole discussion there about whether it's talking about the 7 nations that are referred to explicitly in the Torah or any other nations apart from the Jewish people who are in the land of Israel. But basically the Gemara in Avodah Zarah understands that there is therefore a prohibition to sell land, for a Jewish person to sell land to non-Jews in the land of Israel. And that is another reason why, and we'll talk about it, that a lot of people qualify that at certain times, places and people, but there is that prohibition as well, which some people use to explain why it's actually, even if it would achieve peace, even if everyone said there's no danger in it whatsoever, you'd still be forbidden from selling and giving away land to other nations, or even as part of a peace treaty. Those are basically the 2 halachic reasons people use when they talk about the prohibition, or they claim that there is this prohibition, and many do, of giving away land. In the year 1979, Rav Ovadia, who at the time, you've all been listening to what I talked to you when I was speaking about his biography. So what's Rav Ovadia doing in 1979? Chief Rabbi of Israel, exactly. Sephardi Chief Rabbi of Israel, and he comes to Mosad Rav Kook. He comes to a particular place in Yerushalayim to give a lecture. And at the time, by the way, the Ashkenazi Chief Rabbi, who's known for his very right-wing views, is Rav Shlomo Goren, former Chief Rabbi of the IDF as well. And he gives a lecture which becomes very controversial, and if anybody wants to look it up, I should have quoted the other 2, the other tshuva, by the way, the other halachic response of anyone who wants to actually learn it inside, because like any halachic responsa, everyone has a different interpretation of it, and the common denominator with 90% of the people who tell you about halachic responsa is they've never actually read it inside, they've just heard about it. Okay, so the first one is in Yabia Omer. Rav Ovadia basically has 2 different sets of halachic responsa. One is Yabia Omer, which is actually goes on, most of the halachic responsa in those sets of, or that set of books, goes on for pages and pages and pages, very detailed halachic responsa, and that one is in Yabia Omer, the one about the Ethiopians, is in Yabia Omer, book number 8, and I think it's section number 11. The other one he has is, by the way, it's called Yechaveh Da'at, which is much shorter, because basically what it was every Friday, when he was the chief rabbi, I think, people used to call up on a radio station and ask him halachic questions, and he would answer them. And obviously, not a lot of time on the radio, so he made it a lot shorter, and that was then transformed a few years later into a set of halachic responsa written down. Anyway, very interesting books. Probably not going to get through all of them in your lifetime, because they're quite heavy, but anyone who wants to read from the halachic responsa that I've just quoted, the first one is in 8, book number 8, section number 11. That one's the one about the Ethiopians. This one about land for peace actually was based on a talk he gave, not something he decided to write up, but this talk he gives in Mosad Rav Kook in 1979. Everyone comes thinking that they're going to hear something from Rav Ovadia, and they hear, and most of them are in shock, because he says basically that under the right circumstances, if the ministers and generals all agreed that it was okay and it would add to the peace and security of the land and state of Israel, it would be permitted, he says, to give away parts of the land of Israel for the peace and security of its citizens. How does he get away with some of the things that I've just spoken about? The Ramban, the prohibition of lo techanem. Yes?
Is there a difference between giving it away and selling it?
So the difference between giving it away.
It's like a selfish thing. You get a personal benefit from selling because you got money. Giving it is about protecting the people around.
Okay, so a couple of ways around it. One is that he says the Ramban doesn't, just because you have to settle the land, there isn't necessarily a prohibition of giving away parts of it. Okay, for example, you could settle the land on the land that you have, and there's an obligation to do that. The other thing is that the Ramban is only one opinion. For example, the Rambam doesn't seem to suggest that there is a mitzvah at all of Yishuv Haaretz, of settling the land of Israel without, when it's not the times of the Beit HaMikdash, the times of the temple. With regards to Lo Techanem, the prohibition about selling land to non-Jews, Rav Ovadia actually claimed that doesn't apply. This is a minority opinion, but he claimed that doesn't apply to non-Jews who are not idol worshippers. And since he says most of the non-Jews in the land of Israel are Muslims who are not, there are opinions that they do fall under this category, but according to most opinions, they're not idol worshippers. He says, therefore, that there is no problem with selling, well, in the right circumstances, giving away land. I feel like I'm not really doing the Tshuva Halachic response enough justice because it goes on for pages and pages. But basically, his conclusion is that like I said, under the right circumstances, he even begins basically by saying that at the time he's talking, it's all hypothetical. It does, however, become practical for his own political party about 15 years later. What happens in the early 90s in Israel?
Gulf War.
After the Gulf War?
They give back the Sinai.
No, that's in the early 80s. That's the agreement that Begin signs with the Egyptians.
Oh, they retreat from
No, Gush Katif is in 2005. Talk about the early 90s. They left Gaza in 2005. The early 90s, after the Gulf War, in the Oslo Accords. And it's in the Oslo Accords that part of the agreement is to give part of the land or put part of the land under Palestinian leadership and authority. They don't really give away parts of land where Jews are living, but they do give away part of the land to and under the control of the Palestinian leadership, which until today, many places you'll see, for example, in Gush Etzion, when you turn to Efrat, so on the other side, which is the entrance to Bethlehem, there's a big sign today saying this is the territory of the Palestinian Authority, and people with Israeli citizenship are actually not allowed. They're forbidden under law from entering those parts, and that's part of the Oslo Agreement. Now, why is that got anything to do with the Tshuva? Because based on this halachic responsa, Rav Ovadia's political party, Shas, was in the Rabin government at the time of the Oslo Accords, and because of this, I mean, obviously they ask him again, but because of his position on the concept of land for peace, they actually abstain. They don't vote for it, but they also don't vote against it, which allows Rabin to carry the agreement in the Knesset and gives him a majority, or at least not a majority that would be against it, and it passes. It's interesting how this halachic responsa has very much a practical ramification on the state of Israel. His tshuva, his response on land for peace. Now, this responsa is particularly controversial because many people say that he took it back and that he retracted it later on. I'm not enough of an expert to say whether he did or didn't, but like many halachic responsa, depending on your sort of agenda or sort of what you would like to teach and say and portray, you'll say, no, they didn't really mean it, or the halachic responsa was only for a certain time or a certain group of people. Like I said, most of those people who say those things haven't actually even read it inside, but nevertheless, that particular one is quite controversial because there are many people who say that later on in his later life he took it back, but it definitely was... Sorry?
Did Rav Goren comment?
Yeah, Rav Goren, look, Rav Goren and Rav Ovadia, unfortunately, didn't have, definitely at the beginning of their tenure as Rav Goren being the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Rav Ovadia being the Sephardi chief rabbi, didn't have the best relationship. Rav Ovadia called Rav Goren and his sort of group of people, the Aseret B'nai Haman, right? The 10 children of Haman. Rav Goren called Rav Ovadia Gaddafi, so they didn't always have such a fantastic relationship, unfortunately. And although we laugh, it was very sad and tragic because they were two people who really could have changed the entire fabric of how halacha is viewed, how religion. I mean, they were not just Gedolei Torah, not just great Torah luminaries, but also characters very much in their own right, whose contribution to the state of Israel will be known not just for decades, but I think centuries to come. And so it was sad that at least at the beginning, they didn't. Just very briefly, one of the reasons that the main blow up, the reason why they didn't get on, at least at the beginning, was because there was this whole, which you'll know about, is there was this whole controversy about someone who, Rav Goren, he was exactly that they're Mamzerim, and Rav Goren came along and said, no, they're not Mamzerim, and everyone disagreed with him, including Rav Ovadia. So that didn't help things. But anyway, that's the second halachic responsa. Again, I think it's important just because of the practical ramification it had and still has on the state of Israel. Now we're going to get a little bit less controversial, I think. But that is, but this one I feel like sort of a lot easier and smoother. And the third one I'm going to talk about is one which actually I think is more well known, which is the Tshuva, the halachic responsa of Rav Moshe Feinstein on Chalav Israel, right? Or products or milk, which is actually not Chalav Israel, and the permissibility to drink it. Now the reason why I bring it is not because I think it was necessarily earth-shattering. There are actually, people don't know this, but, sorry, I say people don't know this. There are a lot of people who don't know that there are other, going back already a couple of hundred years, there's a discussion about what about on a farm where there are only kosher animals, and so there would be no chance of mixing the kosher milk with non-kosher milk, that maybe you'd be able to drink it. It's not necessarily Rav Moshe Feinstein came from nowhere and gave this sort of halachic responsa. But before we do any of this, let's talk a little bit about Rav Moshe Feinstein. Who was Rav Moshe Feinstein? Sorry? He was definitely a Talmid Chacham, but he lives in, well, for most of his life, and actually Rav Moshe Feinstein, interestingly, and you see this throughout many of his halachic responsa and other writings and sermons that he gave, is incredibly grateful for the opportunities he was given in the United States of America. Talks about it a lot, and Thanksgiving and things like that, about his appreciation for the United States of America and the opportunities they'd given him and his family when they came from Europe. But apart from being, having his own yeshiva, he's not really known for that. What he's known for is halachic responsa. He's really known in many places as the Posek Hador, the halachic decisive, I don't know but have a better word, of his generation. But the interesting thing about Rav Moshe Feinstein, and I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek because I'm sure there are people who disagree with me, but definitely from the Tshuvot, the halachic responsa that I've read of his, is he's very, I don't want to say progressive, because in the frum world today progressive means that you just, right, you've lost the plot, but he has a lot less. Many of his tshuvot do not, the concept of Masorah, the concept of doing this has to, even if there's no explicit source for it, we do it because our parents did it and our grandparents and our great-grandparents. Obviously he sees that as important, but he doesn't see it as important as many other halachic authorities of his generation. In other words, if something can be permitted, he often, and doesn't have an explicit source forbidding it, he will sometimes permit it where some of his colleagues don't. And that is an interesting general observation that made about Rav Moshe Feinstein. An incredible Talmid Chacham, a genius, humble, well-respected, basically by the entire Jewish people, and a real and big tzaddik. And he was asked about, so there is a prohibition, just to sort of, let's go back to basics, there's a prohibition of drinking milk which has not been supervised by Jews. Why is there a prohibition like that? It's in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Why is there a prohibition like that?
It might come to be mixed with the milk.
Right, exactly. Exactly. It might come to be mixed with the milk of other animals. The Tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein basically says that because of the restrictions and penalties that were put in place for somebody who would advertise milk, right, but would be mixing milk with, not just with cow's milk, but with milk from many other different animals, and the restrictions and the penalties and the supervision that was put in place by American government authorities. That is enough. He calls it Anan Sadeh. That's enough almost to be witness to the fact that it is milk which is just coming from a cow, and therefore it would be kosher. It doesn't call it Chalav Yisrael, it calls it Chalav Stam. Ordinary milk, but it's not Chalav Vacuum. It's not milk which is produced, sold by non-Jews, and therefore he permits drinking it. Now, admittedly, there is a whole debate on this topic specifically, about whether or not he permitted it as an ideal, or he permitted it because there were some people, for example, where I grew up in Perth, if you couldn't drink, if everything you had to eat and drink was Chalav Yisrael, which there were maybe 3 people in all of Perth that did that when I was growing up, it's very difficult. Right? It would have been very difficult. So there was a whole debate whether Rav Moshe Feinstein permitted it even as an ideal, or he permitted it because he was asked, and there were certain communities where it was very difficult to keep Chalav Yisrael. So he says, you know what, with communities like that, there is what to rely upon just to have regular milk because of the different restrictions and policies put in place by the American and to extension by most Western bureaucracies and governments all over the place when it comes to producing and selling milk. So there is a debate. Amongst that, for example, Moshe Feinstein himself did not drink milk that was not Chalav Yisrael. He also didn't encourage anyone, any of his sort of institutions not to have, or he sort of, on the contrary, he encouraged them only to drink Chalav Yisrael. So there is a whole debate about whether that was seen as an ideal or really only sort of if you have to kind of thing. Sorry, David, did you have a question? Okay, but I bring that halachic responsa because it's well known, because it's interesting, because it shows Rav Moshe Feinstein's ability to be lenient where he could. I'm not sure that it was so earth-shattering, but it does definitely bring up a heated debate up until the year 2019. By the way, there are other reasons to only drink, and this is coming from someone who doesn't only drink or eat Chalav Yisrael, but there are other reasons to drink and eat Chalav Yisrael which are not just dry, technically halachic. There is an idea based in Kabbalah and Chassidut, I believe, in the concept of your emunah, your bitachon and emunah in Hashem being affected by drinking non-Chalav Yisrael milk. So the reasons to drink or not to drink are not just dry, technical, halachic reasons. I should add that as well. Any questions up until now?
Just about Chalav Yisrael, how does it apply in Israel today?
What do you mean by how does it apply? Most, not everything, but most things in Israel today, Chalav Yisrael. Definitely not everything, but most things in Israel.
As such, or does everyone just presume it is?
No, that would definitely be labelled. Now, the other...
It's labelled the opposite. We had this when we were there a few years ago. Here it says Chalav Yisrael, and if it doesn't say those words,
it says Chalav Nochri,
it's not. But there it says...
It's Chalav Nochri,
Chalav Nochri,
but the other there are many products, for example, that are imported, right? Mouth bars, right? So obviously that stuff is also not Chalav Yisrael. The truth is that at the end of the day, and once again coming from someone who didn't keep Chalav Yisrael even in Israel, it's really easy to keep Chalav Yisrael in Israel. But again, I can't talk because I didn't do it, but it's definitely easy to keep, a lot easier. I remember, anyway, so when I was a teenager, so there was a whole group of us, I don't know why I'm telling this story, but there's a whole group of us. There's a whole group of us that were keeping Chalav Yisrael, and the problem was that, B'nai Camp came. We must have been about 14, and obviously at the tuck shop they're selling 12s and Twixes and Mars bars and whatever. So everybody sort of, after about day 3, couldn't contain themselves, so we have to do Hatarat Nadarim and start eating the Cadbury chocolate again, which probably wasn't the right way to go. But nevertheless, I do think it's an important mitzvah, whether or not people, again, I don't only drink and eat Chalav Yisrael, but what is important is, one, to think about the tshuva of Moshe Feinstein, which we've just learned, but also to realize that the reasons for doing it are not just technical dry halachic that Rav Moshe brings up in his own tshuva. Any more questions before I could talk about the last? Yes.
So essentially, is that seen as a leniency, or because like
Again, it really depends on how.
in New York and like Russia was on the Lower East Side, like many communities there think that Chalav Israel is like an extreme chumrah almost.
Yes, and I think that Chalav Yisrael is a chumrah as well. But if you were to ask other people, they would
That
say
itself is a debate. If it's a
correct.
core or it's a core.
That if you were to ask people, that it very much there are lots of different opinions on the matter. I think it's a chumrah, but there are many other people who think it's a kula. Right? It's exactly the opposite. It's a leniency, and really even Rav Moshe Feinstein, who gives the leniency, definitely thought the ideal was Chalav Yisrael. If I was giving the shiur just on Chalav Yisrael, we would talk about it for a little bit more. It very much depends on, like I should have, started by this by saying on all these things. I'm not here to give psak halacha. Consult your local Orthodox rabbi, but it is an interesting discussion. It's an interesting discussion which has many whole different spectrum of opinions. The fourth and probably the most sensitive of all the different halachic responses. I'm not pulling out my phone to message. I've actually got something written down that I wanted to share with people. Is a tshuva from Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the Tzitz Eliezer. Anyone heard of the Tzitz Eliezer?
Yes.
Who said yes?
Yeah.
Okay, Jeff, who was the Tzitz Eliezer?
No, any details.
Sorry?
I have no idea other than what
You just heard Tzitz Eliezer. You're like, oh, I know that guy. But you can't necessarily put a finger on how you know
I don't
him.
know which the specific true is though.
Right, so Rav Eliezer Waldenberg is most well known, apart from being a big Talmid Chacham, who lives, in fact, out of all the people I've just mentioned, he's the only one who I believe is born in Israel as well. He died, I think, about 10 to 15 years ago. He was the sort of chief rabbi of the Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. That's what I guess in general he's most well known for, because he deals a lot, and his halachic responsa deal a lot with different medical issues. And of course, in his time, just in his lifetime, the amount of new innovative technology and medications and questions that therefore come up, not just from a medical perspective, but also sort of concept of pikuach nefesh, of saving one's life, and the army and the police force and all those different things. So those come up very much as he's living. The new questions should being asked, or even the question of artificial insemination and IVF. And one of the things we're going to talk about, for example, is transgender and gender reassignment. And the only thing we're going to concentrate on today is actually the technical, dry, halachic aspect of it, because he is asked
When was this written?
in 1970. He's asked about a married man, who has surgery, becomes a woman. And he's asked about whether or not that person, or that woman now, would have to give a get. Right? Would have to divorce their wife. And interestingly, he quotes a tshuva which was written about 100 years before him, and this is where I wanted to look up because he's not so well known, of Rav Yosef. His name was Rav Yosef Pelagi. Rav Yosef Pelagi, basically, who he quotes and seems to hold by, says that it goes after the person's external signs and anatomy, and therefore he claims that somebody who was a man and is now a woman does not have to give a bill of divorce to their wife because they're no longer a man. So they're no longer a man, they don't have to give a get. Now that is something, by the way, that almost everyone disagreed with him about. He seems to be, on this particular issue, a very much minority opinion, and there also is a discussion about whether that he would say that applies to everything. Right? For example, a woman who becomes a man, are they now obligated in tefillin. So if you're going to say that he talks all about the external sides and anatomy, so then you would say, yes, that person is obligated in tefillin, but many people say that he was just answering that specific question about the divorce that was asked to him. It wasn't to say that that applies across the board to everything. This is written, by the way, 50 years ago, almost, which in the context of what we're talking about is actually a long time ago. I know it doesn't sound like a long time ago, but in the context of what we're talking about today is very much a long time ago. Yes, sir?
Will you have brought the whole issue of the insulin and
Yes, he talks about that as well. He does. There are other halachic, I don't want to call it responsa, but there are definitely plenty of halachic and I'd say hashkafic literature which has been written on the subject as well. I wanted to avoid that because it's a very sensitive issue as well, and just talk about the specifics of the question that Tzitz Eliezer was asked. That's something which, and that question is a question which is still very much being discussed, which I think definitely in terms of the literature which is going to be written about it as well, definitely hasn't reached its conclusion. But it's interesting, and first of all I wanted to bring a halachic responsa from the Tzitz Eliezer because he's so important to much of the medical halachic literature that we have today. Like I spoke about, he was the chief rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek, from hospital at a time when there was so much new innovation and medicine and technology, and therefore he's an incredibly important posek. He's an incredibly important rabbi in terms of many of those new halachic questions that have come out. And this one is obviously both a very sensitive and very topical question, which he seems to have quite a novel approach to, which others don't. Again, I also have to add that many people say that he was just answering that specific question and it wasn't something that he said across the board, but nevertheless something which is interesting and very much is an important question that is continuing to be asked, but was asked of him close to 50 years ago. Are there any questions?
Is there any reference in the Torah to the changing of your sex?
Not explicitly, no. There are different, how would I call it? There are definitely different, in any halachic responsa, and that's why it's so, if you really want to, one of my rabbis in yeshiva who recently passed away, Rav Binyamin Tabori Zichrono Livracha, blessed memory, always used to tell me that if you really want to get a wide depth and breadth of knowledge in halacha, right, in Jewish law, the best books to read are these books, lots of different variety of books of halachic responsa, because they quote so many other sources and they give you so much of a background. You think you're reading about one question, but you end up learning about different midrashim and different parts of the Gemara that you don't know about, and different other halachic responses that were written a few hundred years before the one you're reading. And so obviously all of these halachic responsa rely on different sources that came. A person doesn't just sort of write, oh, this is what I think, so this is what it must be. Obviously they all rely on sources from the Torah, the Gemara, the Midrashim. And so on many of these new questions which have come up in the last 100, 150 years, there's no explicit reference to it in the Torah, but definitely they pull on, or they rely upon and depend upon and use to support their argument many different parts of the Talmud and Midrashim, which definitely seem to hint to the subject, even if it's not a explicit reference. That's the same with many of these topics. IVF, for example. So there is a Gemara, I think, or is it? Yeah, and a Midrash. I think both. Mentioned in different places about a woman who becomes pregnant from sperm which is from sort of outside, she had a bath and there was sperm in the bath, and right, so it's you think it's a bit far-fetched, but they use that to sort of talk about the concept of IVF and the concept of reproduction outside the body. So all that stuff is stuff which is not an explicit reference obviously to IVF, but definitely used in the arguments back and forth. That would be. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming. Thank you again to Rabbi Levi.